Good afternoon, everyone. I think we'll go ahead and get started now. So my name is Kate Brennan. I'm a PhD candidate here at the center, and it's my distinct pleasure to welcome Karin Ingersoll here to speak with us today. She's a scholar, a writer, and a surfer for whom those three undertakings inform each other. She earned her PhD in political science from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and in 2009 received a Mellon Hawaii postdoctoral fellowship. So if you haven't already, I encourage you to read her book. Here it is, Waves of Knowing, about which she will be speaking today, and she published that with Duke University Press in 2016. Now, a significant part of her research project has been to envision how she can serve her community and pass down through the generations what had for long been known before the breach of American colonization. In her book, she contests commonplace notions about how an identity is or is not considered authentic as she proceeds from an inherited oral history of surfing through the process of documenting it and critiquing its exploitation and appropriation. What I really appreciate about her work is that she works along that faint threshold between orature and literature, and between land and sea, just as surfers read the waves of the ocean's surface, where water and air meet. And indeed, the ocean and the seas are an extension of the island's earth and basalt. Now, because surfing is a site of colonization and its possible undoing, dropping into a wave is a way of reading the ocean as an archive and of acquiring those ways of knowing developed by the Kanaka Maoli, which are instrumental to decolonizing the Hawaiian Islands. Karin deftly balances her critique of the neo-colonial commodification of surfing as an industry with her theorization of how He'e Nalu can liberate Hawaii's many languages, verbal, oceanic, and genealogical alike, from the tyranny of capitalist settler colonialism. Now, as I read through Waves of Knowing, I was prompted to think of the concurrence of linguicide and the Anglo-American colonization of maritime regions, as well as their indigenous cultures, and how our perception and experience of topography can change according to different toponyms. We come to know place through language in that respect. And so I was reminded by Karin's work that restoring the Hawaiian Islands, coasts, and waters is part and parcel of revitalizing the Hawaiian language and the knowledge accrued throughout its history. Now, in the Hawaiian language, He'e Nalu literally means surfing or sliding into a wave, right? But Karin reminds her readers that it means more. As a verb, Nalu means to contemplate and to meditate. As a noun, it means a wave, but also the amniotic fluid which nurtures a developing child in the womb. Thus, surfing is not merely riding water's undulating surface, but submerging oneself within the life force of the ocean. With grace and precision, Karin's work performs every sense of He'e Nalu, whether she is reading and writing or surfing and stewarding her community. Please give Karin a warm welcome.
Aloha mai kako. Welcome everyone this afternoon. Thank you so much, Kate, for that introduction, and a very sincere thank you to all the organizers of this conference. It's such an inspiring and important conference, and I just have had the most warm, heartfelt welcome here in Toronto, so my aloha to you all. So I come to you from Manoa Valley on Oahu in the Hawaiian Islands, and I live there with my two sons, Naheolu and Kahoi, and my partner Russell, and I am a surfer. My partner Russell is a voyager, and we both surf waves, me on my Papa He'enalu on my surfboard, Russell on his Wa'akolua, his voyaging canoe. And our interactions with the ocean have really evolved for both of us through our lives. In our teens and our early 20s, being on the ocean was a lot about recreation and training and social activity, a little bit about learning the winds and the currents, the surrounding reefs of our islands, maybe learning a little bit more about how to become stronger, more responsible individuals. But now, when we enter the ocean, we find that we're entering a place that really ignites. Sorry, I forgot about my images here. We find that we're entering a place that really ignites our spiritual awarenesses. And we feel empowered politically and personally because we realize we're entering a process of reimagination and potential and possibility that the ocean, as the ocean embraces us like an ancestor, bringing us back to an awareness of our historical relationships with the sea and with our ability to relocate our senses of self in the sea. And when we enter the ocean, the first way that we begin to experience this empowerment and connection is through our bodies, kinesthetically. Before we think or imagine or intellectualize how we're going to navigate past the shore break or to our destination island, our skin feels the chill of the spray, and our noses inhale the salt, and our ears hear the purr or the roar of the waves. So I realized that before I enter the ocean, no matter how long or short my interaction, I want to first connect to this place and time of the seascape, because if I can make this connection, which doesn't have to be a profound connection, just a little acknowledgement of how my body can breathe in the rhythms of the waves before I enter them, then my experience becomes more of one than just getting wet. And my work has explored the potential of this embodied. And many contemporary surfers, like most tourists and myself, have slipped onto the path paved by colonialism, which really shields them from seeing or concerning themselves with the geopolitics within their surf dream. The ocean is commercialized, coaxing surfers into purchasing the perfect wave and their perfect surf fantasy. However, the enactment of surfing hasn't been colonized in Hawaii. He'enalu is still an activity with social, political, spiritual, and economic significance to Hawaiians, and it remains a contemporary way that Native Hawaiians can connect to an indigenous ontology and epistemology about the interconnection of pathways leading out from an origin within to connect to seascape epistemology. When I'm surfing, my center or my pivot point finds a rhythmic alignment within the waves. Rhythm being the contraction of movement into physical forms. And my center makes sense of both movement and stasis, engaging in what Paul Carter terms an idiokinetic intuition as I'm stitched into the passages of the world. And the rhythms of the seascape assemble with my body, and an ocean body assemblage occurs and emerges. And the term ocean body assemblage is built from Manuel de Landa's assemblage theory, in which an entity is defined by the totality to which it belongs and by its relations to other parts of that whole or society. So according to de Landa, of the three forms of matter, solid, liquid, and gas, liquid has the most potential to create because it's always on the edge of chaos. So here lies my potential to self-organize a complex identity. Hawaiian and American, I can be Hawaiian and American, artist and oceanographer, logical and emotional, all while moving through a liquid form of cultural genealogy and distinct yet improvised rhythms. And as the rhythms of the seascape assemble with the surfer's body, identity becomes an effective process over time and through philosophical and kinesthetic interactions with place. As the body interacts with the ocean, ways of knowing and being are opened up to innumerable ways of moving, pausing, constructing, and deconstructing ideas and identity. So when I surf at La'io Pikipikio, my body is affected by its whole history of relations with the sea, just as the sea is affected by its whole history of relations with my body, the whole history of human beings, including our human emotions. And I construct my own conception of existence through my phenomenological insight and methods as connected to place, thus allowing for an imagined existence in the world based on my embodied involvements with it. And I think, even though I'm not a voyager, that this concept of creating an imagined existence in this world that emphasizes a relationship to place is more vividly illustrated through the oceanic literacy of navigation. For instance, a navigator at sea is constantly processing information as he or she reads the seascape throughout days, weeks, even months, making determinations based on his or her body's memory of that information. So he or she must make decisions based on the embodied knowledge accumulated in her nose, on her skin, in her gut, and her conscious and rational mind leans on cellular knowledge, intuition, and this kinesthetic reading of and reaction to the signs that are retained as embodied engagements. So to explore this relationship more deeply, let's look at what the Oceanic Literacy of Navigation entails. So many of you are likely familiar with the Native Hawaiian voyaging canoe Hokulea, which has completed its 3-year-long worldwide voyage, the voyage called Malama Honua, Caring for Our Island Earth, which she sailed with her sister canoe, Hikianalia. And Hokulea is Native Hawaiians find self-sufficiency even in a global economy. It's where we cleanse, play, dye, honors Native histories. It allows for flexibility and movement, particularly nonlinear movement. And the ocean is a place that Native Hawaiians see connecting us to the world rather than separating us from it, which is a concept very eloquently articulated and asserted by Tongan scholar Pele Haupa in his essay, Our Sea of Islands, which really helped to decolonize the minds of Pacific Islanders who have been told repeatedly that their island nations were isolated, insignificant, weak. And instead, Haupa argued that these islands were connected into a boundless sea of possibilities, and the ocean is like a highway that connects them rather than separates them, and that Pacific Islanders have a long history of migration and cultural exchange that supports this and strengthens them as individuals within a region. And Haupa also suggests in his essay, The Ocean in Us, that, quote, an identity that's grounded on something so vast as the sea should exercise our minds and rekindle in us the spirit that sent our ancestors to explore the oceanic unknown and make it their home, our home, end quote. So we can see how the links between identity and place are not static. For Hawaiians, this politics, these moments and interactions revolve around a specific interaction with the seascape rather than a geocentric model that engages a proprietary contract with land and ocean. And so Seascape Epistemology builds upon these concepts and provides a methodology that reveals linkages between land and water. And Seascape Epistemology engages a discourse about place that recognizes the ocean's transient and dynamic composition, as I stated. Waves are constantly formed and broken, sucked up from the very body that gave it life, and no part of this liquid is ever stable, yet something endures within this space and time, which are relationships. And these relationships draw together the sea's collective components through engagements, such as surfing or swimming or diving. So in my work, developing the concept of seascape epistemology, I'm aiming to pull the ocean back into a discussion about indigenous territory. And I'm exploring the potential and power that the seascape holds not only for and within Native Hawaiian epistemology, but also against colonial structures that I think are not protecting our oceans and seas, nor are they fostering the development of critical relationships between humanity and their seascapes. So to paddle on a surfboard and to push oneself over the edge of a breaking wave, jumping to one's feet on a gliding board, releasing control to the power of the wave rather than trying to control the wave, and to then harness the power of that wave, is to engage a seascape epistemology. And to voyage in a double-hulled canoe across thousands of miles of raw ocean, relying only upon the constantly circulating stars, wind, waves for direction, while centering oneself inside this flux, is to embrace the seascape epistemology. And these are the two ocean-based knowledges, or oceanic literacies as I term them, that I'm going to talk about today to help us see how we can realize the seascape epistemology. So let's start with the oceanic literacy of surfing. And as Kate, I need to add what you said into my definition. It was so eloquent and insightful. But in Olelo Hawaii, in Native Hawaiian language, he'inalu is surfing. But he is also octopus, as octopus would cause to spread out, or to slide, surf, slip, to put to flight, flow. Nalu is wave, surf, full of waves to form waves. To ponder, meditate, reflect, mull over, speculate. So Heinalu is not just sliding across waves, it's also sliding into a ponderous state of thinking and theorizing about the world through a specific context. And it's also putting to flight the formation of waves. Heinalu is an act that helps the seascape to move itself, putting waves or concepts and bodies into flight. And Native Hawaiian surfers have historically tapped into the wisdom of how waves move. Waves have arms, fingers and legs, backs, lips, faces. And waves move with a gut pulled by forces from the universe. Waves, the ocean's current, the moon's currents, the sun's reflecting waves, the pull of gravity, the rotation of the earth. And we recognize that each wave is unique, finding individual expression while moving in general rhythms. And Native Hawaiian surfers have studied and named and ridden and lived off of these waves for centuries. And they've learned through the oceanic literacy of surfing to harness this power to reestablish our indigenous geographic identities through knowledges of and relationships with place. And for instance, my favorite surf spot is called Laeo Ku Pikipikio, which is the southernmost point on Oahu. And just down from the reef from this point, there's a koa, or a fishing station that is said to have been established by Ai, who's the son of a fishing god Ku'ulakai. And today, as I sit offshore at this surf spot, what I see are multi-million-dollar homes that front the beach. The neighborhood is called Kahala, which is one of the most affluent, if not the most affluent neighborhood in the state. And still, sitting in the ocean at the surf spot really holds the potential for me to reaffirm my ability to create a multi-sided identity that sits outside of the Euro-American narrative of real estate and state and federal zones and restrictions and boundaries. Here I'm not academic or mother or mixed breed, because here, by surfing and reading the literacy of Ai in the process of placemaking, I've looked at how traveling on and through the ocean engages in epistemology, which I term Seascape Epistemology. And a seascape epistemology is an approach to knowing presumed on a knowledge of the sea, which tells one how to move through it, how to approach life and knowing through the movements of the world based on a visual, spiritual, and embodied literacy of the seascape. And when I speak of seascape, I'm speaking of it from a Native Hawaiian epistemological perspective, which includes the birds and the colors of the clouds, the flows of the currents, the fish, the seaweed, the timing of the ocean swells, different ocean depths and fluctuations of tides and celestial bodies, the stars, the planets, all circulating and flowing in swings and pulsations. But as a philosophy of knowledge, seascape epistemology isn't about the ocean or the winds as things. It's more about the ocean and the wind as interconnected systems that allow for successful navigation through them. So it's an approach to life and knowing through passages, organizing events and thoughts according to how they move and interact, all while emphasizing the importance of knowing one's roots, center, or location inside this constant movement and fluctuation. So seascape epistemology engages a discourse about place that recognizes the ocean's transient and dynamic nature, and even becomes a fluctuation of a process that joins the world together. Moving with the fluvial seascape speaks to how we inhabit the earth with our bodies, our minds, emotions, and spirits. And what I'm hoping to express today is how the development of a relationship with the seascape through the enactment of ocean-based knowledges, like surfing and voyaging, can help us to find compassion through connections that offer us flexibility and multiplicity in our lives. And I first started to think about how surfing was something more than an activity that I loved and lived for. When in 2006 I was hired as a surf guide for a surf camp in Samoa on the island of Upolu, known today as Western Samoa, which is an Australian run-and-own surf camp. And I was ecstatic. I had this chance to to essentially expand my surf territory to the South Pacific, to these perfect uncrowded waves and to continue my challenge of my fears and knowledge revolving around the ocean. But I was quickly awakened to the colonial acts that were taking place within my surf dream. Just some quick examples. English was the predominantly used language at the camp, and all the local Samoan staff were asked to speak English. The camp had been there for years. None of the Australian employees made any effort to speak one Samoan word that I heard. They also created this artificial sense of private property through fencing and the manipulation of vegetation and around the camp. And foreigners aren't allowed to own land in Samoa. And most vibrantly, the camp had hired some local Samoan fishermen to use dynamite to blow up some of the reefs fronting the surf camp to create channels for their surf boats to more easily access the waves. And as you can all imagine, the reefs are critically important to the local Samoan people, culturally, economically, politically, spiritually. So I left immediately, and I started to think really hard about how surf tourism was impacting the ocean and the people and the indigenous activity itself of surfing back in Hawaii, where surf tourism is much, much more developed and predominant than it is in Samoa. And more interestingly, I think, I began to really articulate and theorize about how surfing was simultaneously serving as a means of continued empowerment for Native Hawaiians within this proliferating neocolonial industry. And within the context of what I saw in Samoa and at home in Hawaii, which was in short, a neocolonial approach to the ocean itself, one of domination, ownership, otherness, something that needed to be conquered by surfers. For example, plastered all over surf media is terminology such as killing waves, thrashing waves, owning it, all which present the ocean as a place to serve the surfer or tourist. And today there are still debates over ownership rights of waves discovered by surf explorers. So the ocean becomes this place of consumption. So from this realization, I began to articulate how surfing was an approach to knowing and being, for me, that privileged and alternative political and ethical relationship with the surrounding physical and spiritual world. And I began to articulate how surfing enabled Native Hawaiians a way of being both indigenous and modern, with multi-sided identities unbound by these Western categories, and how the ocean enabled a reimagining of places, spaces, and ways of knowing and being for in the world. And this is not just an epistemology for Native Hawaiians, but my work specifically does focus on what Seascape Epistemology offers Native Hawaiians because of our specific colonial history. And also because Native Hawaiians have an ontological connection to the ocean. Our very being comes from the sea. We're born from the sea. It's a place of ancestors, which we know from our predominant oral chant and story, creation story, He Kumalipo. And, sorry, I'm a little off. And I also look specifically at what Seascape Epistemology offers Hawaiians because the ocean is a place where in the seascape, which is a literacy that placed fishing stations here not only to designate fertile grounds, but to also teach people different fishing techniques such as net weaving and the proper protocols that were often connected to conservation practices and spawning times and things of that such, and pond building. So I'm able to engage in a performed pattern that kinesthetically and visually documents events in the Hawaiian seascape for me. So surfing at Laio Ku'upikipikio writes this language into existence, transcribing history and culture through a momentary act. So remembering Ai becomes a political act in the face of the colonial presences of both dominant Western thought worlds present in the seascape, but also the presence of neocolonial surf tourism in Hawaii, both which tend to drown out this memory. And what becomes visible is how identity through kinesthetic involvements with the ocean can be deconstructed and reconstructed through movements and imaginations, and emerging with place that honor place-based wisdoms and memories in an era of ecological destruction and detachment. And the sensory motor pathways that the body creates for itself engage in oceanic literacy or an embodied reading and writing of a specific oceanic space, which for me are effective philosophical and spiritual movements of recovery. Many Hawaiian memories and places have been recently dominated by imperial understandings of history, as it has all around the world. You know, the dominantly used name of Laio Kupikipikio, even by myself, is Black Point, which is the name that Americans gave to it. And that's the name that I learned growing up as I surfed that spot. And now I understand that the activity of surfing itself has traveled. It's evolved. And my point isn't for a return to something, it's for an expansion of something, an expansion of the ways that our bodies and minds are allowed to intimately interact with the ocean. For instance, in looking at how surfing as an activity travels, there are numerous new ocean spaces that surfers increasingly seek out. The sport's boundaries have expanded to include Antarctica, the Galapagos, Lake Superior, Amazon River, and even traveling wave pools on cruise ships. So as surfing travels, so do the spatial metaphors of surf spots. Waves march, currents circulate, sound shifts, and even images of surf spots move through photographs and the internet, films, stories, songs, art, and dances. And bodies within these changing locales have also moved, touring new spatial possibilities. And a tourist in Hawaii brings his or her own ideologies and modes of dwelling to Hawaiian waters, while a native Hawaiian surfer might remember Ai as a means of recreating connections to ancestors. So spaces themselves are created and destroyed as the enactment of surfing moves. And now thinking about spaces, Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari speak to smooth and striated spaces. Smooth, they're defining as being a non-metric and a directional path that can rise up at any point and move to any other point, like a formless and amorphous space. Striated is a space that is limited by the order of its own space, or by present paths between fixed and identifiable points. So as I imagine it, limu, or seaweed, which is growing and crawling up and around a concrete jetty, might represent a smooth space, and the jetty a striated one. And the smooth space of the limu, or the seaweed, and of the ocean itself allows for diversity and for the emergence of marginalized identities, simply because it allows for movements between the lines. And a politics of aesthetics emerges as the seaweed not only creates but also makes visible new spaces within the striated space of the jetty. Now, striated and smooth spaces can't exist in isolation. They must always coexist and even interchange and intermingle. The ocean itself is a smooth space of creation for native Hawaiians, but it's also simultaneously a striated one, as it's coded and decoded and detailed to those familiar with the wave shapes and frequencies, and it can be divided into political and economic locales. And in the ocean, spaces and movements can be confined for native Hawaiian surfers. Foreign bodies crowd surf breaks and beaches, leaving no space for specifically Hawaiian movements. For instance, surf media, largely in the 1950s and has continued through today, has really created the myth that it was the American surfer who helped to recover the lost sport of surfing in Hawaii. And we know that the practice of surfing was never lost by Native Hawaiians, although the practice was diminished with the arrival of the missionaries who deemed it to be hedonistic and sacrilegious. And specifically, the dominant narrative in the industry is that American big wave surfers, called rhino chasers, they ride these large big wave surfboards called guns. They were the first to ride the big waves at Waimea Bay on Oahu. But Native Hawaiians undoubtedly rode these large waves, which we know through documentation of our oral histories, yet that remains to be the dominant narrative even today. And the result of these narratives has been an overshadowing of Hawaiian claims to land and sea and the expansion of American maneuverability and control or ownership. And the result is also a perpetuation of Euro-American ideology, which approaches the ocean itself from a position of conquest and consumption. Old replica of an ancient native Hawaiian voyaging canoe, which first sailed in 1976 from Hawaii to Tahiti. And the intention of that maiden voyage was to prove that Pacific Islanders intentionally settled the islands of Polynesia and the Pacific hundreds of years ago, and then could find their way back using only oceanic navigational methods. And the dominant narrative at the time was that Pacific Islanders accidentally drifted to these islands. So since 1976, Hokulea has been a leader in the growing indigenous renaissance in Oceania, in areas of language, dance, literature, art, everything, really. And in 76, this specific voyaging group, some were Native Hawaiians, some were not, but those Hawaiians were literally sailing in the wake of their ancestors to find pride in their people and in themselves. And this is what the ocean offered them. And with the worldwide voyage, that potential really expanded to include the entire world into the mission of the canoe of refocusing ourselves back toward our relationships with and responsibilities to the ocean. So I spoke extensively with the visionary for this worldwide voyage, Nainoa Thompson, who is also president of the Polynesian Voyaging Society, which is an organization that really oversees all the voyaging in Hawaii. So I spoke with him to try and articulate the oceanic literacy in non-instrument navigation. So it's worth mentioning that Nainoa is a very humble and naturally quiet man. You know, he's extremely pensive, not just thoughtful, he's actually very intense. And he's wholly passionate about leading through example. You know, he's become a man of words, but he's not naturally. He said that he really gained his confidence through his connection to family and to the ocean. Because he told me back in 2008 that he had made a commitment to touch the ocean every day because it was his source of strength and well-being. And he touched the ocean, I think, to remind himself who he was and where he wanted to go. You know, Nainoa knew that by connecting to the ocean, he could see pathways forward for himself. And that's what the ocean offered him as a young man. And I now see that what he was also doing was his whole life is he was really consciously placing his body into the sea, teaching the nerves in his eyes and his shoulders and his muscles to feel its knowledge. You know, listening, watching, reacting so that he can voyage through the ocean, so that his mind could imagine how to use the ocean's knowledge, which he knew was very deep. So Nainoa in his early 20s when he was on the return voyage of the 76 voyage to Tahiti. And this was a voyage that would forever change his life's mission. However, in 76 on this voyage, there was no Native Hawaiian navigator available to navigate the canoe because the oceanic literacy of deep sea voyaging had been lost in Hawaii because deep sea voyaging had ceased. So there was an extensive search, and eventually this group of voyagers found in the small island nation of Micronesia where there were still many fishermen who had to go out past the reefs and out of sight of their islands. They still retained this navigational knowledge because they needed to then find their way back home if they lost sight of the island. So there were still coveted master navigators in these islands. So the crew in 76 sought out one of these master navigators, and his name was Malpiailug. It was from the island of Sadawal. And they asked him if he would navigate this canoe for them, and he agreed, and the voyage was successful. They arrived, and the canoe proved to be seaworthy. But for many Hawaiians on the canoe, that one trip wasn't enough. You know, they wanted to keep sailing Hokulea. Sorry, this is map. And one very determined Native Hawaiian on that canoe was Nainoa. So Nainoa studied the stars on his own, but eventually he realized that he was going to need to return to Mau and his island in 1979 to humbly ask him to teach his sacred navigational knowledge, and it was sacred. but Mao sought and was granted permission to teach Nainoa. As Mao realized himself that this knowledge was in danger of being lost forever, as the world was increasingly modernizing and becoming globalized. And this was really, truly a great cultural gift of knowledge bestowed upon Nainoa from the Micronesians. So Nainoa and Mao studied, but it was an adapted way of learning for Nainoa because his mind was very modern and westernized. He had to think in ways that were more familiar to him at first. And this was something that Mao realized first as he started to work with Nainoa. So he slowly began adopting oceanic navigational concepts and found a way to adapt it to Hawaiian culture and geography. And for instance, just a quick example, Nainoa had told me that excuse me, to calculate the speed of the canoe, what Nainoa initially had to do was he would look at a bubble at the front of the yako, at the front of the canoe, and count how many seconds it took to get to the back of the canoe. And that's how he could calculate his speed, because an hour later he would then find another bubble and count, and obviously if it took longer, he was going slower. If it took less time, he was going faster, and that's how he initially had to calculate his speed. And he said, eventually, I didn't need that anymore. Eventually, as his body learned to experience the voyage itself, he said he didn't need that anymore. So getting back to how Seascape Epistemology and Oceanic Literacy help us to create an imagined experience and existence in the world through our interactions with it. In navigation, Nainoa stresses that before you physically leave on a voyage, you have to imagine it. You have to see that destination island in your mind. And if you ever can't see that destination in your mind, you're lost. So a lot of navigation is image-making power. And in addition to that image, a navigator must also draw an imaginary line between the canoe and the destination island. So as he or she steps onto the platform of the canoe, he begins to pull that destination island to the canoe along this imaginary line that he's drawn in his mind. And this is really an extraordinary concept used in oceanic navigation. As the sails fill with wind and push the canoe and crew forward, the navigator imagines the canoe as being the stationary point. And the canoe is the center, the stable point, and the seascape is what is moving around it, including all of the islands and the destination island, which is pulled to the canoe. And this concept of the canoe being the stationary point is at the heart of the Carolinian navigational technique called itak, which is what Malkiailuk uses. And I don't have time to explain how itak works when you're in the canoe, and I don't think I could do it more than very fundamentally. But the basic concept that I want to emphasize is that the seascape moves around the canoe, which allows one to always know one's position and location as induced by the signs in the natural and supernatural surrounding world. And the voyager becomes the center through a specific interaction and relationship with the seascape. Yet, this center is never fixed. It's never fixed in physical location when voyaging. It's a location within the navigator's mind and body that guides him or her through the ocean. And furthermore, in the oceanic literacy of navigation, islands don't just move, they also expand and contract. Oceanic voyagers, as the movements of these islands, so they expand and contract. So they expand as, for instance, the reef, fish, and the birds and plants move out or travel out, and then they contract as their inhabitants journey back home. So the boundaries of the islands and the reefs are perceived as fluid and connected to the life within them. And created is an epistemology and ideology of travel where one's roots have routes. So again, identity becomes multiple, fluid, and complex, and focus is placed on creating and connecting rather than drawing static lines and grids across the ocean, grids of latitude and longitude, for example. And the oceans and skies are mapped in a sense because they have houses, as they're called in oceanic navigation, and paths that they move along and that the navigators memorize and use as guides, but the islands and reefs also move along these paths. And these paths themselves are mobile, right? Which is a big difference epistemologically and ideologically. So what this image-making power enables is a way of moving through the world that harmoniously communicates with your own mind, body, and the moon and the stars and the birds, so that they're all connected as individual parts of a functioning whole. And voyaging becomes an embodied voyage, a way of knowing and being through corporeal interactions with the seascape. So as master navigator Bruce Blankenfeld told me, who happens to be Nainoa's brother-in-law, he says that most of the seeing is inside. So there's his destination island that he can always see in his mind from the time of departure, but there's also the stars that he can see marching across the sky even when the clouds cover them, or when he's closing his eyes half asleep, because Bruce does navigate in this way. He can see things as his feet and back feel the direction of the ocean ground swells, the roll and pitch of the canoe. And this enables him to see his direction by feeling the direction of the swells. Thus, he knows where the cloud-covered stars are in relation to the canoe. So every sensation that a navigator's body feels from the seascape are burned into muscles, becoming a cellular memory that's interpreted by the mind. And it's this constant interaction between the seascape and the body and the mind that creates this specific epistemological context that expands Blankenfeld's or Bruce's world to include an intimate relationship with the open ocean. And there's a duality between an analytical awareness and a sensational imagination when voyaging. So the way that Bruce physically moves through the ocean affects how he sees it. And again, seeing becomes a political and ethical process that can be discerned to know distinct worlds. As Bruce's sight is expanded through his oceanic literacy, so is his ability to think outside of established and dominant thought worlds. So he is harnessing this image-making power that's inherent in all of our brains by reaching beyond the light that's reflected on our retinas into a realm of seeing through intuition and the aid of environmental cues and personal experience, so he can see the moon even if it's buried by the clouds. But to see your destination island as you voyage, or to see stars that are covered by clouds, is not an easy thing to do. A navigator has to merge his or her body with the seascape. And Bruce says, quote, "Those stars have to become part of you." So for Nainoa, who's very humble, as I stated, and he's also very analytical and thoughtful, merging his body with the seascape did not initially come naturally for him, which he said does come naturally for Bruce. He says that once Bruce steps on the canoe, within minutes he's in this quote-unquote zone, as Nainoa calls it. And Nainoa says it takes him days, almost toward the end of the voyage sometimes, to get into this zone. Nainoa is also extremely humble. So Nainoa told me that there is this zone that you get into in navigation, and they said that confidence, sorry, this is a quote from Nainoa. He says, "There's a zone you get into in navigation, that confidence, that knowing without knowing at all how you know. And that's awesome. That to me is freedom. It's intellectual and physical freedom," end quote. So the zone is a space and time of relationship in which the body is completely affected by the sea. And Nainoa explains again, quote, "No matter what the conditions, everything is connected. That means the heavens, the clouds, the winds, and the waves, they're all connected. They're all making sense. When you're not in the zone, the pieces are disconnected and they don't make sense. There's no class you can take to get in the zone. That's a learned, educated, personal step. If you don't believe it, it ain't gonna happen," end quote. So if you don't imagine the connection, in other words, it won't exist. So a navigator has to learn to feel how to sail with the seascape, not on the seascape, but with it, as part of it. And Nainoa and Bruce are realizing a seascape epistemology by setting into motion an indigenous way of traveling that orients the body inside the moving seascape, as opposed to vectoring oneself off a point that intersects latitude and longitude, which is a way of moving that creates only one type of specific map about social and natural space. In a seascape epistemology, in contrast, what's encouraged is for one to travel through the world through a guidance system anchored in relationships rather than abstract geographic categories. And this matters because it changes the ways in which we see, and that's how we take care of or don't take care of each other and the world. And as Nainoa said, and I'm paraphrasing, but he says, what we don't know, we won't love, and what we don't love, we won't take care of. And this is what I think seascape epistemology offers all of humanity, because the alternative is to travel through the oceans and the seas with an ideology that leaves the body outside of an understanding of the journey and the places that it encounters on this journey. And thank you, Mary, for so brilliantly speaking to the historical context and significance of this image yesterday. Very little of what I could have articulated. And I love the question from the young woman about the unfinished coastline here. And I think there is actually a difference between coastlines and the coast, but that's for later. But so in this type of ideology, the ocean becomes the other, as seen through examples of both early Western and modern travel practices, which embrace an ideology of representation of places and spaces through binary oppositions that naturalize a specific political philosophy and order. So otherness of the ocean justifies a desire to control and colonize both the seascape and those encountered across it. So think again of the surf tourism industry that I spoke about earlier. And I love Paul Carter's illustration of this concept in his book, Dark Writing. He says, like a photograph, we're careful to keep our shadows out of the picture. We keep our bodies outside of the landscape that we explore and use, which is a disembodied movement, one that fails to really capture the collective experience of identity because the body is left out of an understanding of the self. And a disembodied way of moving and traveling really neglects all of the memories held within kinesthetic movements, and it erases all of the journeys that our bodies have taken in the seascape. The knowledge is accumulated, the stories told, and the discoveries made. So in a seascape epistemology, knowledge becomes alive as the living sources are carried on the backs of whales and the tails of fish and the rays of the stars. And seascape epistemology is really predicated on action, articulating how one is involved in a world-making process that includes physical acts of displacement as well as physical and metaphorical processes of replacement. And I wanted to share this concept with you all today because, like me, I think you all understand the power and beauty and potential that the oceans and seas hold for us as living and philosophical beings. So thank you all so much for coming and listening to my thoughts about how our intentional engagements with the ocean allow for us to embrace a profound sense of who and where we are in this sea universe so that we can create visions of how we are all interconnected with our diversities through movements and passageways. Because I do believe that humanity is found in the sea. The nature of the sea itself is so complex and alive that it affects our being and creates a state of wonder that we call being human. So I wanted to end today with a short poem by Robert Sullivan, a Maori from Aotearoa, who speaks to this beautifully in his book of poetry called Star Vaka, and Vaka is a canoe in Maori. So this is his poem called Vaka 93, and it reads, "My face is broken by the waves. I am the sea, ocean, giver and taker, primordial, pre-culture, pre-life. To define me is to limit me. One may as well define the planet. Yet I'm delicate, can feel a piece of wood slip across my eye, can feel the call of men rowing as they dip into me, as if I was a well to scoop from. Some of these I have taken into the waters of my being, so I am part human."